What are the rules of power? Are they written in stone, decreed by God and tradition, unchangeable and absolute? Or are they something far more fragile, a gentleman's agreement, a shared illusion, a thin veneer of civility waiting to be shattered by someone with enough ambition, enough audacity to simply refuse to play along? History is filled with moments when these unspoken rules are put to the test. But there are rare, terrifying periods when the rules are not merely bent, but utterly broken and rewritten, not with ink, but with steel and poison. The late 15th century in Italy was one such moment. It was an age of breathtaking paradox. On one hand, the golden light of the Renaissance was at its peak, producing the sublime genius of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Yet, in the shadows cast by this brilliance, a ruthless political game was being played. The Italian peninsula was a fractured chessboard of warring city-states, where dukes, bankers, and mercenary captains vied for dominance. And in the center of this board sat the ultimate prize, an institution of unimaginable wealth and influence: the papacy. The throne of St. Peter was more than a spiritual office. It was a kingdom, a bank, and the most powerful political weapon in all of Christendom. For centuries, the great Italian families had schemed to place their puppets upon this throne, always maintaining the outward performance of piety. They played the game, but they still respected the board, and then they arrived. Into this world of subtle Italian intrigue came a family of outsiders from Spain, a clan with the name Borgia. They looked upon this grand game not as players, but as conquerors who intended to smash the board and take all the pieces for themselves. Their special, terrifying role in history was not simply to participate in the corruption of the age, but to perfect it, to institutionalize it, to strip it of all hypocrisy. They looked at the sacred machinery of faith and saw only levers of power. They treated the Vatican not as a holy sanctuary to be revered, but as a family business to be seized, a fortress to be armed, and a treasury to be plundered. The Borgias are not just another chapter in the long history of papal corruption. They are the ultimate case study in what happens when boundless ambition wears the holiest of masks, and in doing so, reveals the terrifying truth about the very rules of power itself. When Pope Nicholas V drew his last breath, the city of Rome held its own. The great families, the ancient baronial clans of the Orsini and the Colonna, began to move their pieces on the board. For centuries, they had treated the papacy as their private property, a bloody prize to be fought over in the streets and in the shadowy corridors of the Vatican. The papal conclave of 1455 was not a gathering of holy men seeking divine guidance. It was a political battlefield, thick with ambition and old hatreds. The Orsini would sooner see the Turkish Sultan on the throne of Peter than a Colonna, and the Colonna repaid the sentiment with bitter interest. The powerful Italian cardinals, men like the respected Domenico Capranica, found their paths blocked by rivals who would rather see the whole enterprise fail than applaud an opponent's victory. Deadlocked and sweating in the stifling Roman heat, the cardinals resorted to a classic political gambit: the compromise. They searched for a Papa di Passaggio, a transitional pope. The ideal candidate was a man old enough to die soon, foreign enough not to have deep roots in the venomous soil of Italian politics, and seemingly pliable enough to be controlled. Their eyes fell upon a 77-year-old Spaniard, a man of intellect but not, they thought, of ambition. His name was Alphonse de Borgia. He was a master of canon law, a skilled diplomat who had served the King of Aragon. But in Rome, he was an outsider. He was quiet, austere, and most importantly, he was not Italian. The cardinals thought they were being clever. They saw a placeholder, a man who would keep the throne warm for a few years while they prepared for the real war of succession. They couldn't have been more wrong. They thought they were choosing a sheep. They had just invited a wolf to be their shepherd. Alphonse de Borgia ascended the throne as Pope Calixtus III. On the surface, He was everything a pope should be. His great public project was a crusade against the Ottoman Empire, which had recently conquered Constantinople, sending a shockwave of fear through Christendom. He ordered the bells of every church to be rung at noon as a call to prayer for the crusade's success, a tradition that endures in many places to this day. He even posthumously retried and exonerated Joan of Arc, clearing the name of the French heroine. But these were public performances. Behind the scenes, in the heart of the Vatican, his true crusade was not for Christendom, but for his family. Calixtus trusted no one in Rome. To him, every Italian courtier was a smiling assassin, every cardinal a rival. His solution was simple and absolute. He would import his own. A flood of relatives and loyalists from his native Valencia descended upon Rome, a veritable Catalan invasion that shocked the Italian establishment. They were given the most lucrative offices, the most powerful positions, the keys to the Vatican's treasury and its armories. This was not the subtle nepotism the Romans were used to. This was a hostile takeover. At the head of this new Spanish court were the Pope's two nephews, the sons of his sister Isabel. The first was Pedro Luis de Borgia, a man whose ambition was matched only by his arrogance. Calixtus made him captain general of the church's armies, prefect of Rome, and showered him with titles and castles, making him the most powerful layman in the papal states overnight. He strutted through Rome with an entourage of hundreds, a Spanish prince in a city that despised him. The second nephew was a younger man, just 25 years old, blessed with handsome features, a sharp mind, and a charm that could disarm his enemies before they even realized they were in danger. His name was Rodrigo de Borgia. In a move that scandalized the College of Cardinals, Calixtus elevated Rodrigo, a young man with no holy orders and a known appetite for worldly pleasures, to the rank of cardinal deacon. This was not just an insult, it was a declaration of war on the old guard. Another nephew, Luis Juan de Milay Borgia, was also made a cardinal. The Borgias now had 3 votes, 3 powerful voices where before they had none. The old pope had not just laid a foundation stone, he had driven a Spanish wedge deep into the heart of the Roman Church. Rodrigo, the young cardinal, watched his uncle's methods with keen interest. He was learning a vital lesson that the holy laws he was meant to uphold were infinitely flexible in the hands of a man who knew how to wield power. The Roman establishment reacted to this Catalan ascendancy with a fury born of offended pride and thwarted ambition. The Borgias were outsiders, barbarians in their eyes, who spoke a harsh foreign tongue and possessed none of the subtle graces of the Italian courts. Chroniclers of the time, like Stefano Infusura, dipped their pens in venom when writing about them, describing Pedro Luis as a man of pride and cruelty, a leech bleeding the church dry for his own aggrandizement. The air in Rome grew thick with resentment. The Borgia name was spat in the gutters and whispered with curses in the palaces of the Orsini and the Colonna. Fights would break out between Roman locals and the armed Spanish retainers who now swaggered through the city as if they owned it. Calixtus, old and increasingly frail, barricaded himself in the Vatican, trusting only his family, a king on a foreign throne surrounded by enemies. He was planting a garden of hatred, and his family would be the ones to reap its bitter fruit. When the end came for Calixtus III in the summer of 1458, the city of Rome exploded. A visceral cry of "Death to the Catalans" echoed through the streets. A mob, inflamed by the Orsini clan, surged towards the Vatican. Pedro Luis, the hated captain general, had to flee for his life, disguised and humiliated. He would die of malaria just a month later, his vast fortune vanishing into the pockets of his enemies. It seemed as though the Borgia enterprise had died with its patriarch. Their power, built so quickly, had crumbled just as fast. But amidst the chaos, one Borgia did not run. Cardinal Rodrigo, only 27 years old, displayed a coolness under pressure that would become his hallmark. He remained in Rome, weathered the storm of hatred, and participated in the conclave that elected the next pope, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who became Pius II. Rodrigo had learned a critical lesson from his uncle's brief, tempestuous reign. Calixtus had shown him how to seize power, but his downfall taught Rodrigo something far more valuable: how to keep it. Raw force and blatant nepotism were not enough. One needed patience, alliances, subtlety, and a deep understanding of the long game. His uncle had opened the door, but Rodrigo knew he would have to walk through it with far more cunning. And so, for the next 34 years, spanning the reigns of 4 different popes, Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia waited. He was a patient predator in the Vatican jungle. He did not challenge the powers that be directly. Instead, he accumulated immense wealth through the many lucrative church offices he held, most notably the vice-chancellorship, the second most powerful position in the Curia. He became a master of Vatican administration, a connoisseur of art, and notoriously, a connoisseur of women. He built a network of spies and allies, bought loyalty with promises of promotion, and studied his rivals with the intensity of a chess master. He was playing a different game now, not a sprint for power like his uncle, but a marathon. He was building his own foundation, not on the shifting sands of a single pope's favor, but on the bedrock of gold, influence, and secrets. The question that hung in the Roman air was not if the ambitious Spanish cardinal would make his move for the throne, but when. And when that moment finally came, would the Vatican be ready for the reign of a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of sin? For 34 years, Rodrigo Borgia had played the long game. While other men rose and fell, while popes were crowned and buried, he remained. As Vice-Chancellor of the Holy Roman Church, he was the master of its vast and labyrinthine bureaucracy, the man who knew where every florin came from and where every secret was buried. His personal palace was one of the most magnificent in all of Rome, a fortress of power and pleasure decorated by the finest artists. He had amassed a fortune so colossal it was second only to the papacy itself. He was no longer the frightened young nephew hiding from Roman mobs. He was a titan of the Curia, a prince of the church in every sense of the word, especially the worldly one. When Pope Innocent VIII died in the summer of 1492, Rodrigo Borgia knew his moment had arrived. The marathon was over. It was time for the final brutal sprint. The conclave of 1492 gathered in the Vatican, a nest of vipers shimmering in their sacred vestments. 2 men stood as giants in Rodrigo's path. The first was Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, the future Pope Julius II, a man of ferocious ambition and an iron will, and the nephew of a previous pope. He was Rodrigo's implacable enemy, the champion of the Italian establishment who saw the Spaniard as a corrupt interloper. The second was Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, brother of the powerful Duke of Milan, a pragmatist who saw the papacy not as a spiritual calling, but as the ultimate asset for his family's portfolio. The conclave was not a debate over theology. It was an auction, and the soul of Christendom was the item on the block. Della Rovere had the backing of the French crown and the Republic of Genoa. Rodrigo had something far more persuasive: cash. What followed was one of the most notorious and shameless campaigns of bribery in papal history, a practice known as simony, elevated to a high art. Rodrigo, unable to win on political influence alone, set out to buy the votes he needed, one cardinal at a time. To one, he offered a lavish castle. To another, a lucrative bishopric. To the aged Cardinal of Venice, he promised the rich abbey of Subiaco and all its revenues. He was a master salesman, tailoring each bribe to the specific greed of his customer. But the final deciding vote belonged to Ascanio Sforza. Sforza was the kingmaker, and he intended to be paid like a king. The price for Sforza's soul, and the souls of the cardinals he controlled, was staggering. Rodrigo Borgia promised him the single most powerful and profitable office in the Curia, his own position as vice-chancellor. He also threw in his family palace, the magnificent castle of Nepi, and a payment in silver so vast it had to be transported under the cover of darkness. The Roman diarist Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, recorded the event with chilling clarity. On the night before the final ballot, 4 mules laden with sacks of silver trod silently through the dark Roman streets from the Palazzo Borgia to the palace of Ascanio Sforza. That silent procession of animals carrying a king's ransom was the true papal election. The voting that followed the next morning was merely a formality, a piece of theatre to legitimize a transaction made in the shadows. On the morning of August 11, 1492, the white smoke rose. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia emerged onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica as Pope Alexander VI. The city of Rome celebrated with festivals and bonfires, as they did for any new pope, hopeful for a generous patron. But those in the know, the ambassadors and cardinals who had witnessed the auction, were filled with a cold dread. The Florentine ambassador wrote grimly to his masters that a man had been elected who would be the most terrible of all. Giovanni de' Medici, a young cardinal who would one day be Pope Leo X, was said to have whispered to a colleague, "Now we are in the power of a wolf, the most rapacious perhaps that this world has ever seen, and if we do not flee, he will inevitably devour us all." The wolf was on the throne, and his first priority would be to feed his cubs. If Calixtus III had treated the Vatican like a family business, his nephew Alexander VI ran it like a criminal empire, and he made no apologies for it. The thin veil of clerical piety that previous popes had maintained was torn away. Alexander was a man of immense appetites for power, for wealth, for women, for life itself, and he saw no reason why the papacy shouldn't serve them all. His long-term mistress, the beautiful and intelligent Vanozza dei Catane, mother of his 4 most famous children, was installed in a palace nearby. But the star of his court was the breathtakingly beautiful Giulia Farnese, a young noblewoman married to a member of the Orsini clan. Her affair with the aging pope was so public and so flagrant that she was mockingly known throughout Rome as La Sposa di Cristo, the Bride of Christ. Her influence was so great that Alexander even made her brother Alessandro Farnese, a cardinal, leading Romans to nickname him Cardinal Ganella or Cardinal Skirt. This was the new Vatican, a place where holy office was the price of a sister's virtue. Alexander's greatest devotion, however, was reserved for his children. He adored them with a fierce, almost primal love, and his entire papacy was engineered to elevate them to royalty. His favorite at first was Giovanni, or Juan, a handsome, preening peacock of a young man. Alexander made him Duke of Gandia in Spain and intended for him to be the family's military champion. The second son, Cesare, the most intelligent and ruthless of the brood, was forced into the church against his will, just as his father had been. Alexander made him an archbishop at 16 and a cardinal at 18. It was like caging a tiger in a sanctuary. Cesare wore the scarlet robes, but his eyes held the cold gleam of a predator. The youngest son, Geoffrey, was married off to a princess from Naples. And then there was Lucrezia, the jewel of the family. Beautiful, intelligent, and blonde, she was her father's darling and his most valuable political pawn, her hand in marriage, a prize to be bestowed upon whichever ally was most useful at the moment. He openly paraded them at official Vatican ceremonies, a shocking display in an institution supposedly led by celibate men. He was not just a pope, he was a patriarch, the founding father of a dynasty he intended to last for centuries. The Apostolic Palace, once a place of solemn prayer and quiet diplomacy, was transformed into a stage for the Borgia family's spectacular ambitions. The halls echoed not with Gregorian chants, but with the sounds of music, laughter, and extravagant parties that lasted for days. The most infamous of these, an event that would forever stain the name of Borgia, was the so-called Banquet of Chestnuts. As recorded by the ever-present diarist Johann Burchard, on the night of October 30th, 1501, a supper was hosted in Cesare's apartments in the Vatican. 50 honest prostitutes, as Burchard called them, were in attendance. After the meal, the candelabras were removed from the tables and placed on the floor, and chestnuts were scattered among them. The prostitutes and the guests, including, according to the diary, the Pope himself, then crawled naked on the floor, competing to pick up the chestnuts. The evening allegedly concluded with prizes awarded for the men who could perform the most times with the courtesans. Historians debate the literal truth of Burchard's account. Was it an accurate report, or was it the exaggerated gossip of a scandalized courtier? In a way, it doesn't matter. The fact that the story was told, written down, and most importantly, believed by so many, reveals the depth of the depravity that people associated with Alexander's court. He had shattered the illusion of papal holiness so completely that no story, no matter how debauched, seemed impossible. He wasn't just breaking the rules. He was dancing on their ashes, laughing, while the foundations of the church trembled beneath his feet. But a pope who rules like a king inevitably makes kingly enemies. Alexander's reign was not just a succession of lavish parties, it was a precarious balancing act on a high wire of international politics, and the ground below was swarming with rivals waiting for him to fall. His first great test came just 2 years into his reign, a crisis that threatened to sweep him from the throne entirely. In 1494, the young and ambitious King Charles XVIII of France marched his army into Italy. It was a terrifying force, the most modern army in Europe, with a train of mobile siege cannons that could shatter the walls of medieval castles in mere hours. Charles's official goal was to press his ancestral claim to the Kingdom of Naples, but his shadow fell long and menacingly over Rome itself. He was egged on by Alexander's mortal enemy, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, who had fled to France and was now whispering in the king's ear, urging him to depose the heretical Borgia Pope. As the French army swept down the peninsula, Italian states either surrendered in terror or foolishly tried to fight and were crushed. Panic seized Rome. Alexander seemed trapped. But here, the wolf showed his cunning. Instead of fighting a war he couldn't win, he played a masterful diplomatic game. He first fortified Rome, then opened its gates and allowed Charles VIII to pass through peacefully on his way to Naples, treating him as a guest while secretly seething. But as Charles was celebrating his easy conquest in the south, Alexander was busy behind the scenes, weaving a web. He forged the League of Venice, a grand alliance of the Papal States, Venice, Milan, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Spanish monarchs. Suddenly, Charles VIII found himself in a trap. His supply lines were cut, and his route home was blocked by a massive coalition army. The French king had to fight his way out of Italy, abandoning Naples and leaving his grand ambitions in ruins. Alexander had outmaneuvered him completely, not with swords, but with treaties. He had proven himself to be a political survivor of the highest order. While Alexander fought his battles with kings, another, more insidious war was being waged for the very soul of Italy, and its general was a Dominican friar from Florence named Girolamo Savonarola. While the Pope reveled in worldly excess, Savonarola preached apocalyptic fire and brimstone. From the pulpit of Florence's cathedral, this gaunt, wild-eyed prophet condemned the sins of the age and, most venomously, the corruption of the Antichrist Pope in Rome. He inspired a wave of religious fanaticism in Florence, culminating in the infamous bonfire of the Vanities, where his followers burned mirrors, cosmetics, fine dresses, musical instruments, and books they deemed immoral in a great pyre in the city square. At first, Alexander tried to ignore him, then to silence him with the offer of a cardinal's hat. an offer Savonarola scornfully rejected. But when the friar began to challenge papal authority directly and call for a council to depose Alexander, the Pope's patience ran out. Alexander VI excommunicated him, a spiritual death sentence. He then placed political pressure on the Florentine government, which, fearing the Pope's wrath and growing tired of Savonarola's rigid rule, finally turned on their prophet. In May of 1498, Girolamo Savonarola was hanged and his body burned in the very same square where he had held his bonfire. The message was sent to all of Christendom. Alexander Borgia's authority was absolute. You defy it at your peril. Yet the greatest threat to the Borgia dynasty would come not from a king or a friar, but from within the dark heart of the family itself. In June of 1497, a tragedy unfolded that would change the family's destiny forever. After a dinner at their mother's vineyard, the Pope's sons, Duke Juan and Cardinal Cesare, rode out into the Roman night together. They parted ways, and Juan, the handsome, arrogant Duke of Gandia, his father's favorite, rode off with a mysterious masked man and was never seen alive again. When he didn't return, the Pope descended into a frantic, desperate panic. He ordered the Tiber River to be dredged. Soon, the body was found. One had been stabbed 9 times, his throat slit. Most tellingly, his purse, still heavy with gold ducats, was untouched. This was no robbery. It was an assassination. The Pope's grief was volcanic and terrifyingly public. He locked himself away, weeping uncontrollably, crying out that he would have given 7 papacies to have his son back. But as the father's grief subsided, a cold political reality set in.
Who had done this?
The Orsini clan were suspect.
A jealous husband, perhaps.
But the deepest suspicion whispered in every corridor in Rome fell upon Juan's own brother, Cardinal Cesare. Cesare had always been intensely jealous of his brother, the one who received the military glory and the secular titles, while he was trapped in the crimson robes he despised. Juan's death was more than a tragedy. It was an opportunity. It removed Cesare's chief rival and cleared his path to become what he had always believed he was destined to be: the sword and shield of the House of Borgia. The wolf had devoured one of his own cubs to clear a path for the strongest. Out Caesar, out nihil. Either Caesar or nothing. This was the motto Cesare Borgia adopted, a declaration of intent so audacious it bordered on blasphemy. For years, he had been a prisoner in paradise, a cardinal of the Holy Roman Church who dreamed not of heaven, but of battlefields and thrones. He watched his less capable brother Juan receive the titles, the armies, and the glory, while he, the true predator, was forced to chant vespers and attend endless ceremonies. Juan's death was the key that unlocked his cage. In a spectacle of unprecedented drama in August of 1498, Cesare Borgia stood before his father and the assembled College of Cardinals and formally resigned his cardinalate. He was the first man in history to do so voluntarily. He cast off the sacred scarlet robes as if they were a costume from a play that had run too long. And in their place, he donned the steel armor of a warrior. The tiger was finally loose. His father, Pope Alexander, moved with breathtaking speed to give his newly unleashed son a kingdom to conquer. The political winds had shifted. A new king, Louis XIV, sat on the throne of France, and he desperately needed the Pope's favor, specifically a papal annulment of his current marriage so he could marry his predecessor's widow, Anne of Brittany, and thus secure her duchy for the French crown. Alexander saw his opening. The price for the annulment would be a royal future for his son. Cesare was dispatched to France, not as a priest, but as a prince, bearing the papal decree. He arrived at the French court in a procession of such staggering opulence that it stunned even the jaded French nobility. In return for the piece of paper that would reshape the French royal line, Cesare received a shower of rewards. He was made the Duke of Valentinois, from which he earned his famous nickname, Il Valentino, was inducted into the prestigious Order of St. Michael, and most importantly, was given a royal bride, the beautiful Charlotte d'Albret, sister to the King of Navarre. But the true prize was a military one. King Louis XIV promised Cesare the loan of French troops to begin the great project of his life. That project was the subjugation of the Romagna. This region in central Italy was, in theory, part of the Papal States, but in reality, it was a chaotic patchwork of small cities and fiefdoms ruled by petty tyrants known as vicars. These men, the Malatestas of Rimini, the Sforzas of Pesaro, the Manfredi of Faenza, paid lip service to the Pope but governed their lands as independent kings, often with extreme brutality. They were a constant thorn in the side of the papacy. Alexander now gave his son a simple, brutal mandate to sweep these vicars from their thrones, extinguish their bloodlines, and forge their territories into a single, centralized hereditary duchy for the Borgia family. Cesare, backed by French lances and papal gold, rode south into Italy. He was no longer just the Pope's son. He was a sovereign prince on the verge of carving his own kingdom out of blood and iron. The age of Alexander the diplomat was over. The age of Cesare the conqueror had begun. Cesare Borgia's campaign in the Romagna was unlike any war Italy had ever seen. The peninsula was accustomed to the theatrical, almost leisurely campaigns of the condottieri, the mercenary captains who fought for contracts, not causes. Their wars were often elaborate dances designed to minimize casualties and maximize profits, with battles being won and lost with little bloodshed. Cesare was different. He was not a mercenary. He was a dynastic founder. He fought not for gold, but for a legacy written in blood and stone. He was a storm front, a force of nature that tore through the Romagna with a speed and savagery that left the old tyrants breathless and terrified. His army, a modern force of French heavy cavalry, Swiss pikemen, and Italian infantry, was fueled by the limitless funds of the papacy and armed with the latest in artillery technology. His first major test came at the cities of Imola and Forlì, which were ruled by one of the most formidable women of the Italian Renaissance, Caterina Sforza. Known as the Tigress of Forlì, she was the illegitimate daughter of a Duke of Milan and a woman of legendary courage and ferocity. When Cesare's envoys demanded her surrender, she retreated to her supposedly impregnable fortress, the Rocca di Ravaldino, and defied him from the battlements. The old condottieri would have settled in for a long, expensive siege. Cesare simply brought up his French cannons and blew a hole in her fortress wall. His troops poured through the breach, and Caterina was taken prisoner, a tigress, finally caged. She was paraded back to Rome as a trophy, a symbol of the old order's impotence against the new Borgia storm. The message was clear: no wall was high enough, no name fearsome enough to stand in Cesare's way. From there he moved on, a relentless machine of conquest. At Faenza, the city was defended bravely in the name of its handsome young ruler, the 17-year-old Astore Thei Manfredi. The siege lasted for months. When the city finally surrendered in the spring of 1501, it was on the condition that the young lord's life and liberty would be spared. Cesare agreed to the terms with a smile. He treated young Astore with honor, keeping him in his court for a time. A year later, the boy's body, with a stone tied around its neck, was fished out of the Tiber River in Rome. Cesare had learned his political arithmetic well. A dead rival cannot mount a comeback. Promises were merely tools to be used when convenient and discarded when they became a burden. His cruelty was not born of passion, but of cold, terrifying logic. He could be just as devastating with cunning as he was with cannon. The Duchy of Urbino was ruled by the respected Guidobaldo da Montefeltro, a cultured and experienced soldier. Cesare approached Urbino not as an enemy, but as an ally, requesting passage for his troops and borrowing the Duke's artillery for a supposed attack on another city. Guidobaldo, suspecting nothing, agreed. That night, Cesare turned his army around and marched on the now defenseless city of Urbino. The Duke was forced to flee for his life in his nightshirt, abandoning his magnificent palace and one of the finest libraries in all of Europe, which Cesare promptly looted. He had conquered a state without firing a single shot, using deceit as his primary weapon. It was a victory that would have made Machiavelli proud. Yet Cesare's genius did not lie only in conquest, but in the dark art of state-building that followed. The Romagna he had conquered was a lawless land, plagued by bandits and feuding nobles. To pacify it, he appointed a man of singular brutality as his governor, Ramiro de Lorca. Ramiro was Cesare's blunt instrument. He swept through the province, hanging criminals, executing troublemakers, and imposing a fearsome order with an iron fist. Within months, the Romagna was safer than it had been in a generation. But the people, while grateful for the peace, had come to despise the cruel Ramiro. Cesare, having used his tool, now saw a final brilliant political opportunity. In December of 1502, he rode into the city of Cesena. On Christmas morning, the horrified townspeople woke to a gruesome spectacle in the main square. Ramiro de Lorca's body, clad in his fine clothes, had been cut in two, laid out on a block of wood with a bloody knife beside it. The message was a masterpiece of political theatre. With one act, Cesare took credit for the order Ramiro had established, while simultaneously satisfying the people's hatred for the man who had imposed it. He presented himself as both the bringer of order and the just punisher of tyranny. It was a masterstroke of calculated terror and public relations. This was not just a brute. This was a visionary, a man with a thoroughly modern understanding of power. His modernity is best illustrated by one of the men who entered his service in 1502 as a military architect and engineer, Leonardo da Vinci. The greatest genius of the Renaissance spent the better part of a year traveling with the most feared man in Italy. Leonardo designed new fortifications, inspected fortresses, and drew revolutionary new maps for Cesare, maps of such accuracy and detail they were themselves weapons of war. The union of the ultimate artist and the ultimate man of action reveals the core of Cesare's character, a ruthless pragmatist who recognized and utilized genius wherever he found it, pressing even the sublime beauty of the Renaissance into the service of his bloody ambition. By late 1502, Cesare Borgia was the undisputed master of central Italy. He was at the zenith of his power, a new Caesar forging a new Roman Empire. But as he stood on this precipice of glory, the very ground beneath him began to crack. His own instruments, the mercenary captains, the condottieri who had helped him win his victories, began to fear him. Men like Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverotto da Fermo, and members of the powerful Orsini clan saw that Cesare was not just another employer. He was building a permanent state, a monarchy that would make their own petty lordships obsolete. They were becoming redundant, and in Cesare's world, the redundant did not live long. And so, in a villa near Perugia, they hatched a serpent's nest of treachery, a conspiracy to destroy their master before he destroyed them. Their rebellion was initially successful. They retook several cities, and for a moment, it seemed Cesare's meteoric rise was over. But the conspirators made a fatal error. They underestimated the depth of his cunning. Instead of panicking, Cesare played the part of the wounded, forgiving father. He sent messages pleading for reconciliation. He claimed he couldn't rule without his trusted captains. He offered them new, more lucrative contracts, a general amnesty, everything they wanted to hear. The condottieri, arrogant and blinded by their early success, believed him. They saw his pleas not as a trap, but as a sign of weakness. They agreed to meet him to seal their new pact in the coastal town of Sinigalia on the last day of the year, 1502. Watching all of this with fascinated horror was a young diplomat from Florence, an observer who would later write a small book immortalizing the event. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli. On the cold morning of December 31st, Machiavelli witnessed a masterclass in political annihilation. Cesare rode into Sinigalia at the head of his troops. The rebel captains arrived one by one, having foolishly dismissed their own armies as a gesture of good faith. They were all smiles and handshakes. Cesare greeted them warmly like long-lost brothers and invited them into a palace for discussions. Once they were all inside, the friendly mask dropped. The doors were barred. Cesare's most loyal and ruthless enforcer, the terrifying Don Micheletto Corella, stepped out of the shadows with his hand-picked stranglers. The trap was sprung. There was no trial, no last words. Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo were garroted back-to-back that very night. The Orsini conspirators were held until Cesare received word from his father in Rome that their relatives had also been seized. Then they too were dispatched. In a single, bloodless, perfectly executed stroke of treachery, Cesare had eliminated all his internal enemies. He had turned their conspiracy into his greatest triumph. As he calmly explained to a shaken Machiavelli afterwards, it was better to eliminate your enemies than to simply defeat them. This was Cesare's legacy, solidified that night in Sinigalia. He became the living embodiment of a new, terrifyingly modern form of statecraft, one divorced from morality, chivalry, or the laws of God. He was the prince who understood that fear was a more reliable tool than love, that promises were disposable, and that cruelty, when used efficiently and decisively, was not a sin but a virtue of the state. By the summer of 1503, his kingdom was secure, his enemies were dead, and his path to becoming the king of central Italy seemed clear. He had built a magnificent, terrifying edifice of power, but he, and even the astute Machiavelli, had overlooked one critical design flaw. The entire structure, every stone and every tower, was built upon a single, aging foundation, the life of Pope Alexander VI. Cesare had told Machiavelli that he had planned for every contingency upon his father's death, preparing solutions for all of them. "I never thought," he confessed, "that at the moment of my father's death, I myself would be at death's door." While Cesare was the sword of the Borgia family, a dynasty is not built by the sword alone. It requires alliances, legitimacy, and the soft power of diplomacy, which in the Renaissance were most often sealed in the marriage bed. For this, the Borgias had another weapon, one seemingly more delicate, but no less crucial. She was the family's golden chess piece, moved across the board of Italy to serve the ambitions of her father and brother. Her name was Lucrezia Borgia, and history would remember her as either the most tragic victim of her family's ambition or as a willing participant in their crimes, a poisoner.
A seductress, a monster in a beautiful dress.
But what was the truth behind the legend? In the savage, masculine world of Borgia ambition, Lucrezia Borgia was the feminine ideal of the Renaissance brought to life. She was celebrated by poets for her cascade of golden hair, her delicate features, and her eyes described as being the color of a summer sky. But beyond her beauty, she was fiercely intelligent, educated in the humanities, fluent in several languages, and skilled in music and dance. She was the perfect princess. In any other family, she would have been cherished, her future a matter of her own heart. In the house of Borgia, however, her virtues were not personal qualities. They were assets on a balance sheet. Her beauty made her desirable, her intelligence made her a capable hostess, and her virginity made her a high-value commodity on the political marriage market. She was not a daughter to be loved. She was a jewel to be traded, a golden pawn to be sacrificed to secure her father's board and advance her brother's endgame. Her life would be a series of weddings, each one a strategic alliance, each one ending when the political winds shifted, leaving her stranded in the wreckage. Her ordeal began when she was just 13 years old. In 1493, she was married to Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro. The wedding was an event of obscene magnificence, a statement of the new pope's power. But the groom, a man in his late 20s, was not chosen for love. He was a Sforza, a cousin to the mighty Duke of Milan, and the marriage was the glue meant to hold a critical northern alliance together for the newly crowned Alexander VI. For 4 years, Lucrezia played the part of the dutiful child bride. But in the Borgia world, 4 years is an eternity. By 1497, the political map of Italy had been redrawn. The Sforzas were no longer useful. In fact, they were becoming a liability as Alexander and Cesare began to pivot towards a new alliance with their enemies in Naples and France. Giovanni Sforza, the provincial lord, was now an inconvenient, embarrassing relic of a discarded strategy. A Borgia does not simply ask for a divorce. They annihilate. But killing a Sforza outright would be too messy, risking a war with Milan. So they chose a weapon far crueler and more psychologically devastating: public humiliation. Alexander declared that the marriage would be annulled on the grounds that it had never been consummated because Giovanni Sforza was impotent. The charge was a dagger to the heart of a Renaissance nobleman's honor and masculinity. Sforza was utterly disgraced. He furiously protested, claiming he had married Lucrezia many times and offering to prove his virility on demand. But no one dared to defy the Pope. He was forced to sign documents confessing his own supposed inadequacy and return Lucrezia's enormous dowry. Humiliated and stripped of his wife and his wealth, Giovanni Sforza needed a revenge worthy of the insult. He couldn't fight the Borgias with a sword, so he fought them with a slander. It was he, historians believe, who first spread the vicious, unforgettable rumor that would define Lucrezia for 500 years. The real reason the Pope wanted her back, he claimed, was not political. It was because Alexander, and perhaps Cesare as well, wanted to keep her for their own incestuous pleasure. The accusation was monstrous, unthinkable, and because it was aimed at the Borgias, everyone believed it. With that single, poisonous whisper, Lucrezia's reputation was murdered, and she was trapped forever in the dark legend of her family. With her name cleared in the eyes of the Church, if not in the gutters of Rome, the now 18-year-old Lucrezia was once again a valuable piece on the chessboard. The Borgias now needed an alliance with the south, with the Kingdom of Naples. The perfect candidate was found: Alfonso of Aragon, the young, handsome and noble Duke of Bisegli, the illegitimate son of the previous King of Naples. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that politics and personal happiness had miraculously aligned. By all accounts, Lucrezia and Alfonso, both still teenagers, fell deeply and genuinely in love. Their court was a place of light and culture, a stark contrast to the dark scheming that surrounded them. In 1499, Lucrezia gave birth to a son, Rodrigo, named for her father. She had a loving husband, a healthy child, and the protection of the Pope. It was a golden, fragile peace, and it was doomed from the start. Because while Lucrezia was building a life, her brother Cesare was building an empire, and the architect of that empire was King Louis XIII of France. The Borgia family's entire future was now staked on their alliance with the French crown. But the French were the sworn, mortal enemies of Alfonso's family in Naples. Suddenly, Lucrezia's beloved husband was no longer a strategic asset. He was a political liability, an enemy spy living in the very heart of the Borgia court. The tension in the Vatican became unbearable. Alfonso, sensing the shift in the wind, even fled Rome for a time, but Lucrezia, pregnant and torn, persuaded him to return. It was the deadliest mistake of his life. The end came with the cold brutality that was Cesare's trademark. On the night of July 15, 1500, as Alfonso was climbing the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, he was set upon by a group of assassins. He was stabbed multiple times in the neck, arm and thigh, but somehow the young duke fought them off and survived. He was carried, bleeding, into the Vatican, where a terrified Lucrezia took personal charge of his recovery. She turned their chambers in the Borgia apartments into an armed fortress. She slept by his bed, dressed his wounds, and even prepared his food herself, tasting it first for fear of the famous Borgia poison, cantarella. For a month, it seemed she might succeed in shielding him from her family's hatred. She failed. Cesare was growing impatient. He was heard to remark with chilling pragmatism, "What is not done at dinner can be done at supper." One evening in August, while Lucrezia and Alfonso's sister, Sancha, were in the room, Cesare's chief executioner, the sinister Micheletto Corella burst in with a group of armed men. He declared that he was acting on orders. Lucrezia and Sancha were forcibly removed from the room, screaming and pleading. The door was closed. A few moments later, all was silent. Alfonso of Aragon, the boy Lucrezia loved, had been strangled to death in his recovery bed. Cesare Borgia had murdered his own brother-in-law within the sacred walls of the Vatican. Lucrezia's heart was broken. The golden peace was shattered, and she was left with the terrifying, undeniable truth. To her father and brother, nothing was sacred. Not love, not family, not life itself, when it stood in the way of their ambition. She was sent away to the town of Nepi to grieve, a gilded exile to hide her sorrow from the world, a princess whose fairy tale had been rewritten by her brother into a horror story. For more than a year, Lucrezia was left to her grief. But for a Borgia, mourning was a luxury, not a right. By 1501, her brother Cesare's conquests had made him the most feared man in Italy, but his new state was an island surrounded by the old, suspicious powers of the north. He needed a bastion, a friendly border, an alliance sealed with the ultimate guarantee. He needed his sister to marry again. The target this time was the greatest prize yet, Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the ancient and illustrious Duchy of Ferrara. Ferrara was everything the Borgia court was not. It was a center of art, learning, and old-world aristocracy, ruled by the shrewd Duke Ercole d'Este. An alliance with Ferrara would give the Borgias something they could not conquer, with an army, or buy with gold, legitimacy. It would wash the provincial Spanish mud from their name and link them to one of Italy's most respected dynasties. There was just one problem. Duke Ercole was horrified by the idea. To the old duke, the Borgias were murderous, incestuous upstarts. The thought of his son and heir marrying the Pope's illegitimate daughter, a woman whose first marriage ended in a global scandal of impotence and whose second husband was murdered by her own brother, was repulsive. He wanted nothing to do with this tainted family. But Duke Ercole was a pragmatist, and Alexander and Cesare were masters of the unrefusable offer, a combination of bribery and blackmail. First, the threats. Cesare's invincible army was camped nearby, and the French king, Cesare's ally, put immense pressure on Ferrara. Ercole knew what had happened to the lords who defied the Borgias. Then came the bribe, and it was the bribe to end all bribes. Alexander offered a dowry of such staggering proportions, it took Ercole's breath away. 200,000 gold ducats, an astronomical sum that could fund an entire war. This came with lavish extras, jewels, priceless fabrics, and major political and tax concessions for Ferrara from the Pope. King Louis of France even offered to make Ferrara's defense a French priority. Duke Ercole held out as long as he could, but in the end, the logic was inescapable. He could either have the Borgias as his in-laws, with a fortune to sweeten the deal, or he could have them as his enemies at the gates. He chose survival. He agreed to welcome the Pope's daughter into his family, and the marriage was celebrated by proxy in the Vatican with a debauchery so extreme it even shocked Rome. In early 1502, Lucrezia left Rome for Ferrara, her departure marked by a procession of unprecedented splendor. It was the ultimate symbol of the Borgia family's triumph. Yet for Lucrezia, it was a moment of profound personal tragedy. In a final act of calculated cruelty, her father decreed that her son, little Rodrigo, the only living piece of her beloved Alfonso of Aragon, was to remain behind in Rome. She would never see him again. As she rode north, adorned in jewels and surrounded by 1,000 retainers, she was leaving behind not just the city of her birth, but the very monsters who had forged her life in a crucible of trauma. She was riding away from her family forever.
And, in the greatest irony of her life, she was riding towards her own redemption.
She arrived in Ferrara, a city that expected a demon ready to hate her. They had no idea they were about to meet their future, a most beloved duchess. This, then, is the central mystery of Lucrezia Borgia. Was she a monster or a martyr? For centuries, history, drama, and opera have painted her as the ultimate femme fatale, a black widow who wore her charm like a weapon. The legend speaks of a hollow ring she wore, filled with the tasteless Borgia family poison, cantarella, ready to be slipped into the wine of an inconvenient cardinal or a tiresome lover. She is the incestuous siren, the willing participant in her family's debauchery, the cold-hearted mastermind behind a beautiful face. This is the Lucrezia of Victor Hugo's play and Donizetti's opera, a figure of Gothic horror and sexual depravity. But this portrait, as terrifying and seductive as it is almost certainly a lie, a masterpiece of character assassination crafted by her family's countless enemies. Let us be historical detectives. The most damning accusation, that of incest, originated with her first husband. Giovanni Sforza, a man publicly humiliated and desperately seeking a slander vicious enough to wound a pope. It was a brilliant piece of propaganda because it was unfalsifiable and perfectly suited the Borgia's reputation for breaking every taboo. As for the poison ring, there is not a single shred of credible contemporary evidence that Lucrezia ever poisoned anyone. The Borgias almost certainly did use poison, likely an arsenic-based compound, as a political tool, but it was a weapon of statecraft wielded by Cesare and his assassins, not the jewel of the Pope's daughter. Her name became attached to the crime simply because she was a Borgia, and the world expected nothing less than villainy from them all. The truth is likely far more tragic. Consider her situation. A teenage girl utterly dominated by two of the most powerful and ruthless men of the age, her father the Pope and her brother the warlord. Her letters reveal not a cunning monster but an intelligent young woman trying to navigate an impossible situation. Her desperate and ultimately futile attempt to save her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, is not the action of an accomplice. It is the action of a victim, a woman who had found a fleeting moment of happiness only to see it extinguished by the cold political calculus of her family. In Rome, Lucrezia was not a queen in the Game of Thrones. She was the board itself, the territory upon which her family's battles for power were fought. Her departure for Ferrara in 1502 was her true liberation. By leaving Rome, she stepped out of the long, dark shadow of her father and brother. In Ferrara, she was no longer merely the Pope's daughter. She was the Duchess, a ruler in her own right, and it was here that her true character, so long suppressed, finally blossomed. The Ferrarese court, which had braced for the arrival of a she-devil, was instead captivated by a woman of grace, intelligence, and immense political skill. She established one of the most brilliant courts of the Italian Renaissance, a haven for poets, artists, and thinkers. The great poet Ludovico Ariosto lauded her in his epic masterpiece Orlando Furioso, praising her beauty and her wisdom. The scholar Pietro Bembo fell in love with her, and their letters reveal a woman of deep feeling and intellect. When her husband, Duke Alfonso, was away at war, Lucrezia ruled Ferrara as regent, and she ruled it well, earning the respect and love of her subjects. In her later years, she turned to intense piety, founding convents and spending vast sums on charity. When she died in 1519 at the age of just 39, the entire city of Ferrara mourned her as their beloved duchess. In the end, the most profound irony of the Borgia saga is this: Lucrezia, the pawn, the supposed victim, the one with the least formal power, was the only one who built a legacy of genuine love and cultural achievement. She outlived the monstrous ambitions that had defined her youth and remade herself, proving that the most powerful act of defiance is not to fight, but to survive and to build something beautiful from the ruins. And so, by the blistering summer of 1503, the Borgia constellation was perfectly aligned. In Rome, Pope Alexander VI was the undisputed master of European diplomacy. In the Romagna, his son Cesare il Valentino was the unassailable duke, his state forged in fire and fear. And in the north, his daughter Lucrezia was the respected Duchess of Ferrara, the family's link to old-world legitimacy. They were at the apex, the summit of a mountain of ambition. They had climbed over the bodies of their enemies. Their power seemed absolute, their future limitless. The great clockwork of their dynasty, assembled with such ruthless precision, was ticking perfectly. But they had forgotten the most powerful force in the Renaissance world, a force that even popes and princes could not command. The ancients called it fortuna. Fortune. Luck. A fickle goddess who gives with one hand and takes away with the other. The Borgias had built their entire empire on the foundation of a single man's life. What happens when that foundation suddenly gives way? How quickly does a stone fortress turn back into sand? August 1503, Rome was a furnace. A suffocating, sickly heat radiated from the cobblestones, and a malarial miasma rose from the nearby Pontine marshes, an invisible poison that hung in the air. This was the season of the Roman fever, a time when death walked the city streets more openly than usual. It was in this oppressive atmosphere that Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare attended a small dinner party at the countryside villa of a wealthy cardinal, Adriano da Corneto. It was a routine evening of business and pleasure, one of thousands in their reign. But it would be their last. Days later, all three men, the Pope, his son, and their host, were struck down by a violent illness. It came on with terrifying speed, raging fevers, stomach cramps, and violent vomiting. The city held its breath. The cardinal, a younger man, eventually recovered. Cesare, at the peak of his physical prowess at age 28, was plunged into a desperate battle for his life, his legendary strength reduced to shivering agony. But Alexander VI, now 73 years old, his body weakened by decades of excess, stood no chance. The question that has haunted historians for centuries is, what was it? Was it simply malaria, the mundane, invisible killer of the Roman summer? Or was it something more sinister, more fitting for the Borgia legend? The story that immediately began to circulate was one of perfect poetic justice. It was said that Cesare, intending to poison Cardinal Corneto and seize his vast fortune, had brought a cask of tainted wine to the dinner. But through a catastrophic blunder by a servant, the poisoned goblets were accidentally served to the Pope and to Cesare himself. They had been caught, the legend insists, in their own trap, slain by the very poison that had been their family's silent coat of arms. We will likely never know the truth, but whether their end was caused by the bite of a mosquito or by a cup of their own cantarella, the result was the same. The foundation of the Borgia Empire was crumbling. The keystone was about to fall. On the 18th of August, 1503, after 12 days of agony, Pope Alexander VI was dead. The news ripped through Rome, and the thin veneer of order he had imposed instantly shattered. The Orsini and the Colonna, the ancient baronial clans that the Borgias had crushed and humiliated, came roaring back into the city, hungry for vengeance. Borgia properties were looted, their Spanish supporters hunted in the streets. But the true catastrophic collapse was happening inside Cesare's own body. The master planner, the man who had prepared for every political eventuality, had failed to account for a biological one. He lay prostrate with fever, his mind sharp, but his body a useless prison, unable to act at the single most crucial moment of his life. His entire world was being dismantled, and he could do nothing but watch from his sickbed. The effect was immediate and total. In the Romagna, the state he had built with such brilliance and cruelty, the news of the Pope's death was a signal for universal rebellion. The cities he had conquered threw open their gates to their former lords. The mercenary captains he had paid with papal gold now sold their swords to the highest bidder. His meticulously constructed kingdom dissolved back into anarchy in a matter of weeks. Desperate, Cesare tried to play one last hand from his sickbed. He needed to control the next papal election. He managed to secure the election of a weak, elderly candidate, Francesco Piccolomini, who became Pope Pius III. Cesare hoped his short reign would buy him precious time to recover his health and his armies. It was a sound strategy, but Fortuna had abandoned him. Pius III died after just 26 days. A new conclave was called, and now Cesare, weakened and with few allies left, made the final, fatal mistake of his political life. He entered into a desperate pact with his family's most hated, most formidable enemy, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere. Della Rovere swore a sacred oath that if Cesare gave him the votes of the Spanish cardinals, he, as Pope, would confirm Cesare's titles and command of the papal armies. Trapped and with no other option, Cesare agreed. Della Rovere was elected with ease and took the name Pope Julius II. The moment the papal crown was on his head, he revealed the depth of his treachery. He broke every promise. He had used his enemy to gain the throne, and now he would crush him. Julius II had Cesare Borgia, the terror of Italy, arrested and stripped of his remaining titles. The great gambler had been checkmated. The wolf had been outsmarted by the old lion. Cesare Borgia, the man who had held Italy in a grip of fear, was now a pawn in a game played by greater kings. Pope Julius II handed him over to the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, who had long viewed the Borgias' pro-French policies with suspicion. The great conqueror was shipped back to Spain in chains and imprisoned in the grim, formidable castle of La Mota, a fortress from which no one had ever escaped. For 2 years, he languished in a high tower, the world he had built now just a distant memory. The man who had moved armies and toppled rulers could do nothing but stare at stone walls and a sliver of Spanish sky, a caged tiger reduced to pacing and plotting. His enemies believed he was finished, a relic to be left to rot. They had forgotten one thing: a cornered tiger is at its most dangerous. In the autumn of 1506, on a dark and stormy night, Cesare made his final, desperate bid for freedom. With the help of a loyal retainer, a rope was smuggled to him. He tore his bed sheets and tapestries into strips, braiding them with the rope to lengthen it. He waited for the guards to change, then squeezed through the narrow window of his cell and began his descent down the sheer castle wall, the wind and rain lashing at him. But his makeshift rope was too short. It left him dangling dozens of feet above the castle's moat. He had no choice. He let go, plunging into the darkness and crashing to the ground below, severely injuring himself. But he was free. Aided by accomplices, the broken but undefeated Cesare escaped on horseback, riding through the night towards the one safe haven left to him in the world: the small kingdom of Navarre. ruled by his brother-in-law, King John III. He was a free man, but he was also a man with nothing. He was a general with no army, a duke with no duchy, a king with no kingdom. His titles were meaningless, his fortune was gone. He was reduced to what he had always despised in others, a common mercenary captain, selling his sword for a modest wage. In the early spring of 1507, he was commanding a small force for the King of Navarre, laying siege to the insignificant castle of Viana, held by a rebellious count. It was a petty provincial squabble, a footnote in history. During a skirmish outside the castle walls, Cesare, ever the aggressor, charged ahead of his men, chasing a group of enemy knights into a ravine. It was a rash, foolish move, the kind of mistake a desperate man makes. Suddenly he was alone, surrounded. The knights he had been chasing turned on him. There was no epic final battle, no grand last stand. There was only a brief, brutal and muddy fight for his life. He was stabbed and speared from all sides. His body, once the vessel of so much power and ambition, was left where it fell. When his men found him later, he had been stripped naked by looters for his fine armor, his body pockmarked with 23 wounds, lying face down in the cold mud and rain. The man who had declared either Caesar or nothing had, in the end, become nothing. His death was as anonymous and squalid as his life had been spectacular and grand. It was the final, cruelest joke played on him by the goddess Fortuna. And so the great Borgia enterprise ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Their fall was as swift and total as their rise had been dazzling. The entire magnificent structure, the duchy and the Romagna, the alliances, the vast fortune, had all been built on the single, unstable foundation of one man's papal authority. It was never a true state, never a lasting dynasty. It was a house built on sand, a spectacular castle that was always destined to be washed away by the first turning of the tide. Their ultimate goal, to establish the name Borgia among the great hereditary houses of Italy, had failed utterly. Instead of becoming a synonym for royalty, their name would become something far more enduring, a timeless byword for corruption, ruthlessness, and the spectacular tragic failure of an ambition that dared to fly too close to the sun. And so the curtain falls. The stage is littered with bodies, the great actors have taken their final bows, and the lights go down on the House of Borgia. What remains, echoing in the silence, is not just a story of a single family's ambition, but a series of profound and chilling lessons about the very nature of power itself, lessons that are as relevant today as they were 500 years ago. The first and most enduring legacy of the Borgias is not a kingdom or a bloodline, but a thesis written in blood. They stripped away the pious hypocrisy that had long shrouded the exercise of power and revealed the cold, brutal machinery beneath. They did not invent corruption, greed, or murder in the pursuit of advancement, but they practiced these dark arts with an unapologetic honesty and a terrifying efficiency that was all their own. They treated the papacy not as a sacred trust, but as the ultimate secular tool, a bank, an army, and a source of absolute legal authority, and in doing so, they demonstrated a timeless truth. Any institution, no matter how holy, can be hollowed out and weaponized by those who are ruthless enough to disregard its ideals. Cesare Borgia, in particular, became the living embodiment of Machiavelli's concept of virtue, that combination of skill, audacity, and force of will. Yet his story is also the ultimate cautionary tale about the power of fortuna, or luck. He was the master planner who had an answer for everything except the one roll of the dice he couldn't control, the cruel twist of fate that laid him low with fever at the exact moment his father's death unleashed the wolves. Their saga also reveals a fundamental, timeless conflict between the great individual and the enduring institution. Cesare Borgia was a political and military genius, a state builder of breathtaking modernity. But the state he built was a reflection of himself. It was personal, charismatic, and entirely dependent on his own life and his father's authority. It was a house built on sand. When the Borgia storm passed, the Republic of Venice, with its complex system of laws and councils, endured. The Medici Bank, built on a foundation of commerce and institutional power, endured. The Borgia dynasty, built on the singular will of two men, evaporated in an instant. The lesson is stark and clear. A personality is not a legacy. True power, the power that lasts for centuries, is not embodied in a single brilliant man. It is embedded in systems, laws, and institutions that are designed to be stronger and more resilient than any one individual. Finally, the Borgias did not just leave behind a legend. They helped to change the world, though not in the way they intended. The sheer, unvarnished depravity of Alexander VI's papacy became Exhibit A in the prosecution's case against the corruption of the Roman Church. When reformers like Martin Luther began to hammer their theses to church doors a few years later, the stories of the Borgia Pope, the orgies, the illegitimate children, the purchased tiara were the fuel that fed the fires of the Protestant Reformation. In their quest to seize control of the old world, they inadvertently helped to give birth to a new one. The great philosopher Lord Acton famously wrote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." The House of Borgia is not merely an illustration of this maxim. They are its defining, terrifying, and eternal proof. Like Icarus, they fashioned wings from sin and gold and flew dazzlingly close to the sun of absolute power. And like Icarus, their story is remembered not for the brilliance of the ascent, but for the spectacular, world-altering horror of the fall. Thank you for joining Dynasties Saga on this journey into the dark heart of one of history's most infamous families. I am your narrator at Dynasties Saga. Until the next chapter.